Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to this Avid audio webinar. My name is Simon Sherborne. I am an audio specialist at Avid based in the UK, and I'm joined by my colleague Daniel, who's in Tokyo, where I think it's the middle of the night.
Just hitting on 1 a.m. It's a great time to be doing a webinar.
All right, so Daniel's going to be talking very quietly, try
That's
not
right,
to
I
wake
am.
up his household. So the idea of this session is it's an audio post update. So it's just a chance to round up all the kind of latest things that are going on with Pro Tools in audio post. We'll be talking about the new hardware product, which is the Pro Tools Sync X. So taking a chance to kind of look a bit behind the technology of that and talk about some of the concepts, in particular frame edge video sync, which is one of those things that we get asked a lot of questions about. So it's a good chance to really dig into that a little bit. And then Daniel's going to take you through a whole bunch of new features that you may not have had a chance to explore yet. I know we all kind of working hard and don't always get a chance to play with new things. And I know when Daniel ran me through these things last night, there was some things that I hadn't actually had a chance to look at yet, that's
Yeah,
really useful.
we've had a lot of good little additions to Pro Tools over the last couple of years, and everyone being busy and not being at trade shows and things like that. We just thought it was a really great chance to show some of those improvements that are hopefully going to help out in your workflows.
So if it's cool with you, Daniel, I'm going to jump in and talk about Sync X
Excellent.
for about 15 minutes,
I'll leave you
and
to it,
then
sir.
I'm going to hand back over to you.
Cool.
So it's the newest piece of audio hardware that we've just recently released, the Sync X. It replaces the Sync HD. Pro Tools HD systems have always had an expansion option for synchronization, and this is the latest generation of that. And it does what the older one did, but it also brings in a few new features, some of which are really just because they're really handy, and some of them just because there are newer workflows now with different video formats and that kind of thing. So we'll talk through some of those features. I'm going to spin it around so you can see what's on the back panel. It's probably the most informative thing. So yeah, the first highlight there is a new feature, and that is an internal video reference generator on this box. So, traditionally in the past, we've always fed video reference from an external generator to Pro Tools via the sync peripheral, and then to any other devices that we want to follow that reference. Now we have the option of generating that internally, which is very handy. It's one less thing that you need to set up, and it's also particularly useful in a facility now where, even though you may have a house reference, there are a lot of different formats of video being worked on now. So if you've got a project that's particularly unusual reference, you can just come offline and run your own reference. And there's multiple outputs of those. If you are using an external reference, obviously we can still take that in via a separate connection, and we have a couple of loop throughs as well, so that you can feed those off to other things. Word clock, of course, is there, probably the most common clock reference that you're going to be coming across, and for that reason we've added 6 outputs, which should cover most situations. In particular, the latest generation of Avid audio interfaces, the matrices, or matrices, I'm not sure which it is, they all have word clock on, so it kind of brings those into the party. We do still support loop sync, which is the traditional interface clocking method that we've got on the other Pro Tools interfaces, the HD series, etc. Time code in and out via LTC. Obviously, you'd expect that. One new thing is the ability to clock to 10 megahertz clock, sometimes called atomic clock, which is popular with kind of high-end music recording and scoring stages. So that is now an option. And then we still have all the stuff that we had previously: MIDI timecode, 9-pin, and then various other slightly more esoteric connections like the biphase, which if you're still using a projector, at times you will need that. And there's more. I thought that was it. Yeah, so just the connection to your Pro Tools hardware is via kind of a proprietary connection, which gives us this direct connection into Pro Tools rather than going through a kind of a standard computer port. Gives us a real kind of direct line into Pro Tools. On the front, I do have a camera set up looking at my sync with my Matrix Studio and my video box there, but it's probably not particularly informative, although you get to see the nice screensaver that's running on there. So probably going to be more useful to show you this graphic that just shows the various displays. Got a nice big crisp display on there. All the control of the box is being done from Pro Tools, but that front panel gives you kind of feedback so you can see what's going on with the session. All right, so that's the idea. Let's have a look at some examples of how it might be used. So the most kind of simple setup would be, just an audio interface, your Pro Tools system, and a sync. So here we've got the sync clocking our Matrix audio interface and essentially just sitting there waiting for other connections to the outside world. And then, yeah, second most common situation we're probably going to see is some kind of video playback device, which we want to clock to Pro Tools. And there we've got video reference connection coming in, which I'm not going to get too much into now because I want to talk about that in a couple of minutes. Yeah, every other possibility, traditional tape machine type arrangement with just an LTC connection, which we can both use for positional timecode location and for tracking the speed of playback. Probably more common now would be a Dolby renderer being clocked from the system and sending timecode out from Pro Tools. If you've got a console of a digital console, you probably replace that timecode from there, bring that in. Yeah, I spotted last time I looked at this slide that I'm missing a word clock connection there, but if I was being really professional, I would have added that before we did this webinar, but there you go. There's no word clock, but there should be. And we could have projectors. We could swap out with an external reference, whether that be video or word clock or 10 megahertz for whatever reason you'd want to do that. And we have that Midi connection as well. And then finally, more commonly now, we're actually looking at these kind of larger systems, especially in a big kind of high-end film or drama or doc with multiple Pro Tools systems. And so in that kind of scenario, you might be running video satellite link to join those systems together, and then using your sync-X's to distribute clock and video frame edge between them, which would look something like this, most likely, with multiple systems. And then in this case, this is just one example, but here we're using a recorder system to distribute clock through the system and video reference. And they're just making sure that all of those systems are absolutely, completely together and all agree on what the time is and how fast they're all going. Okay, just one other quick scenario here is if you've kind of got Dante in the scenario, there are various ways that we can incorporate that. And yeah, I'll show you actually in Pro Tools. It's quite clever how we can actually clock and take frame edge reference from different places now. We mentioned music as the main use of that 10 megahertz clock. And yeah, so I'm talking of this kind of high-end scenario, especially recording, and especially for music, I guess, is the clock system in the Sync X is really like next generation, the same as it is in Pro Tools Carbon. All our interfaces have these great clocks and converters. So if you are in a situation where you need to use an external clock, you don't want that to be compromised. You want to make sure that you've got very low jitter, so you're getting the best possible recording. Okay, before I jump in, actually, no, I'm going to do this bit first before I jump into showing you it in Pro Tools. Um, we thought, just as a bit of added value, we'd like just kind of jump in and talk a little bit about the concepts that we're thinking about with the sync.
Yeah, it's
Um,
definitely an interesting one, isn't it? We have this unit that does something very specific, and it's a quite a unique unit to do this within the audio industry. And what Simon's about to explain, hopefully, will really help understand why it's so crucial, and especially that video frameage thing, which I know Simon's going to spend a bit of time on. But I think he's come up with a really excellent way of explaining it. So yeah, Simon.
Thank you. So yeah, so essentially we're normally talking about two key factors when we're looking at synchronization. There's the positional reference, so that's essentially the your time code position. It's like where are we in our program, and that could be feet and frames. It could be time code. It could be bars and beats if it's a music project. But in general, it's like what's the position that we're all at, and then we have our clock reference, which is essentially keeping everyone running at the same speed. You know, every device has got an internal clock, but they're all going to be just slightly different. In fact, I'll just flip into Pro Tools to show you where those things come out. And I'm sure you've probably seen this before. Just a quick preview in Pro Tools. This is where my SyncX is being set up. So it's kind of directly supported by Pro Tools, and all of the kind of underlying settings are saved in my main peripherals settings. But then most of the time I'm going to be controlling the sync using the session setup so that those settings will be project specific. I can't zoom in to show you this, but hopefully you can see that within my sessions kind of key settings, I have the ability to choose what the positional reference is for this project, which could be time code, it could be machine control, it could be biphase. And I also have clock reference here, which is giving me choices like internal, which is what I'm using at the moment, or external references like video reference, or also time code or word clock. We're going to come back to this. So in the middle, we also have a separate setting here for the video reference for frame edge lock, which is important. So, and various other things we can do like pull up and pull down, which any of you guys who work in film or video post will be very familiar with these concepts. I can generate time code simply by clicking the LTC button here, or Midi time code, do that at the same time. Or we can just chase what's coming in like so. Pretty straightforward, nothing super exciting to look at, but that's where those concepts kind of appear inside Pro Tools. So let's just have a quick look at this final piece of the puzzle when we're looking at video. So you might have heard people talk about frame edge sync in Pro Tools before. The basic idea is that you've got these time code and speed settings, but your video playback is in frames, and those frames kind of appear and they stick around for 25th of a second or whatever it happens to be. So that's kind of a range of time in there. And so the systems really need to know when that frame appears, and that is your frame edge, when that refresh happens on the picture. So without any way for the systems to all communicate that information, each time you start playing back, you're going to be in sync, but it's always going to be slightly off with usually less than half a frame, but the potential is there for it to change from one playback to the next. So the solution to that is to have a common reference or video reference. Sometimes it's called genlock or blackburst or dry level sync. They're all the same thing. They're just a simple video signal that is distributed to all your devices and lets them all see where a video frame should be. So in this case, it would be my video output box and Pro Tools are the two things that need to know that information. So in that case, once we've got that in place, you should see that your audio timeline and your video refresh should be within a sample or two of each other every time, and they will be across all of your devices that are following that.
And I think it was interesting. We did get a question in our previous session. You know, when I used to use tape machines, for example, this is something I had to think about. Is this still important? And even in Simon's small rig that he has there, he does have an external video I/O device, and that video I/O device works on the principle of frame and frame edges, so it needs to know where that position is so that it can play the frame in the correct position. So even if you don't have an external tape machine or something like that, as soon as you start using external video playback devices, this frame edge syncing or blackburst or tri-level or whatever kind of video reference you're using does become really important. And in the simplest terms, it comes from putting together different video equipment and making sure that when you switch between them, that there's no jump or in frames, or a frame doesn't appear halfway through another frame. And that's where this whole frame edge sync and the idea of frames comes from, and having these devices being able to see that means that every single time they start the playback in the same place. And I know the other thing we talked about in the previous session is now there's extremely high quality requirements for some of the streaming services, that the sync has to be extremely accurate. So in those scenarios, if you have an external playback device or video I/O that accepts video reference, that frame edge sync is going to make sure that playback is accurate each time you stop and start in Pro Tools.
Exactly, yeah. And in fact, I'm just going to show you just back in Pro Tools again. So yeah, we can choose what the reference is, and it can be, essentially it will match whatever video format you are working at. So if I switch, currently I'm running internal, so I'm generating video reference from the SyncX. But if I switch to external, my system's going to complain because it doesn't have a reference coming in, but it will let me show you all the kind of different video formats that the system will be able to use as a reference. But also this new feature, which is auto detect formats. So you can actually plug in a reference and the SyncX will tell you what it is, which could be quite handy. I'm going to go back to internal. Okay, so just one visual kind of analogy that I've kind of come up with for how frame edge can be viewed is essentially a marching band or a troop. Each of the people in each of these rows are essentially in sync in terms of position. They're all in the same place and they're at the same clock reference. They're all walking at the same speed. But the frame edge is like where their feet are. So essentially our video reference is like someone calling left, right, left, so that everyone is actually in step. And that's the closest thing that we've been able to come up with to explain it. Okay, I can see we have a couple of questions in, so I don't know if we want to look at those first or whether you want to jump in and do some other stuff first and save it to the end.
Either or is fine. I guess the other thing is we did mention the video satellite situation, and in those situations you have multiple Pro Tools systems, and this issue of the frame edge alignment, each time you stop and start, those frame edges can be different. And when you start multiplying the machines and the equipment, of course, that difference is magnified to a degree because you're working across multiple systems at once. So, you know, it's really just a way of keeping everything together and locked. And especially, as I say, there's, although in some cases you can, you know, just use a video on your internal desktop. When you do start going to external video playback devices, this is the method that has always been used to keep video devices in time, and the SyncX and previously the SyncHD is the way that information gets into Pro Tools.
Yeah, and actually that's a good point. You know, to put it in perspective, it's like, it's not that the system is unusable, you know, without doing this. So, you know, Pro Tools will do its very best to keep your video in sync with the timeline, and it shouldn't drift. You know, I can see there's a question in the chat
That's
about
right, yeah.
whether, you know, whether drift is an issue, and that shouldn't be an issue if everything's set up right, you know, with or without the SyncX. But where it makes a difference is in the kind of critical listening and editing environments. You know, dialogue editors have regularly said to me that they can tell when the system's not gen locked, and they just don't feel like they quite trust that they're, getting what they should in terms of like the feedback. So, people do see the difference.
Yeah, there's definitely some mechanisms in Pro Tools to stop it drifting over time, even as a standalone system. Generally, those drift things tend to be more codec based, more often than not. But of course, having everything sunk together is going to help that, because again, it will help everything be aligned. So there can be drift, but as I say, there is some algorithms within Pro Tools to try and keep that to a minimum, even over long playbacks without sync devices. But certainly, you're going to get a much more accurate start time and overtime with it.
Cool. Well, so then we may get some more questions about the sync coming in, but I would suggest let's look at some of the other new things that we've got to show.
Cool. Yeah, there's quite a bit to get through, so I'll do my best to do so and leave some time for questions. So I'm gonna share my screen here, and hopefully we've got my presentation there. So there's a few things that I want to go over that I'm sure are very important to people working in post. One of those is video and audio file import and export. The next is the bounce enhancements in the new bounce mix window. We've done quite a few Dolby Atmos enhancements over several versions of Pro Tools, but just want to catch up with those. And this last one, while we'll be pushing for time, I'd love to show it because this is one of the things we did for S4 and S6 towards the end of last year. But as we had dark mode and Pro Tools Carbon and multiple other things happening, I think probably not as many people saw it as should. But basically this is a metering mode which people that tend to work in long form projects, films and documentaries like to use. So we will hopefully get a chance to look at that. But first, some video and audio file updates. So for me, I work in post-production, and some of my machines are still running Mojave, and that in that case, even with the most recent Pro Tools update, you still have access to the previous QuickTime export functionality. Now, if you have a newer computer, that may not be an option, but we've done a lot of work to make sure that the files that people commonly use are able to be imported and exported as needed. An update that we did recently, we could do Apple AAC, but we've recently added compatibility in the last release for the ALAC file format also from Apple. So the most commonly used formats in a day-to-day post-production, and in most scenarios, can be imported into Pro Tools, no matter the version, the supported OS version you're running, H.264, DNX HD, and ProRes as some examples. You can import audio from imported video formats, and I have noticed on a couple of forums people saying they haven't been able to import the audio. So that should be working from supported formats, and if it isn't, let us know, and hopefully we can get a sample file so we can work out what's going on there. Another one that was new in 2020.3, I believe it was, is the MXF OP1A audio import. So MXF OP1A is a format that's used for things like XD cam and in broadcast scenarios a lot. Previously we could import the video but not the audio, so this is actually something new that we couldn't do previously. We can import the audio from an MXF OP1A. In the first release of the MOV export of the new bounce functionality, it was only when you had a video clip on the timeline, which I think threw a few people off. So now there's an audio only MOV export. We've also extended the support for more channel types to be supported for the MOV output. Previously it was mono stereo 5171. So now the sort of the formats in between those, like 6.0, 6.1, some of the other formats that are sometimes used are now supported also. We've removed the beta movie MOV export name, so removed beta from the name because it's been out in the wild for a while now, and is working as intended. And we have done some transcode speed improvements And this is important because, of course, we always want to be very straightforward. At the moment, there isn't a same as source movie export, which means when just the audio is changed out and the video section of the file is untouched. At this point in time, it's still doing a transcode, but those transcode speeds are improved. So if you are working on a long form project, you may need to keep this in mind, but I just wanted to mention that. So to look at a couple of things very quickly in Pro Tools. First one is that I am on Mojave on this machine, and that QuickTime bounce to QuickTime is still there. Now what I wanted to do was import a file. Let me grab that file. If I jump here, and here I have an XDCAM file. Now I could drag and drop it, but we actually recommend with the MXF files that you do use the import video function to make sure all of the audio channels are also included. So I can choose this .mxf, and it's an XDCAM MXF. I'm going to push open. And the thing that some people have mentioned they didn't know if was available in Pro Tools is that really important import audio from file. And when I push OK, it's going to tell me, well, firstly ask me where do I want to keep those audio files, but then it's going to show me that there's 16 tracks of audio associated with this MXF file. So when I push OK, it's going to bring in that video and the 16 tracks of, let's jump back to the beginning of the session where it is, those 16 tracks of audio that are associated with that video. So absolutely you can import audio from a supported movie type, and in fact in this case a type that wasn't previously supported. And we did mention in the previous session, Simon, of course, when you're working in a post-production project, that QuickTime reference file from the editors is pretty crucial. The mix that they've done is often different from the AAF that you receive. So it's really important. I'm just going to remove these tracks because I don't need them in this session at the moment. It's really important to give you a reference. Yeah,
it's good to know if as a reference in case you think you might have lost something somewhere along the way as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that functionality is absolutely there in Pro Tools. So let me just jump back to the presentation for a second. So what I want to do next is have a look at the new bounce mix window. What's really nice about this is now that the audio and video exports are in one location, so I think people thought maybe the video exports are just not in Pro Tools anymore. They are there, they're inside the bounce mix window. There's some nice improvements in this window as well. Now there's a preset section so that you can save your commonly used file types as well as locations, which we'll spend a bit more time on because I think there's been a bit of confusion about that. And in the bounce options, what can we bounce? What are the file types available? It depends what's on the timeline, what version of Pro Tools that you have. But rather than looking at them in a presentation, let's jump over to Pro Tools. So of course it's available here in the menu, but of course now it's nice that my bounce mix window is on a keyboard shortcut. So for those of you who work in post, having to use the menu item to get to the QuickTime bounce all of the time, or maybe a shortcut on a EUCON device, was just something that took a little bit of extra time. So it's nice that it's under a shortcut now. So if we have a look here at the options that are available, I've got a WAV file, as you would expect. In my system, I actually have a mapped beds and objects, which we're going to get into in a second when we talk about the Atmos improvements. But we can export an Adm file directly from Pro Tools Ultimate when you have a renderer connected either locally as the Dolby Atmos production suite or externally to a external renderer. You can export the Adm files directly from Pro Tools if you have mapped beds and objects. So that option is there, and in my session I have those mapped so we can see that. We have AIF, AIFF, and MP3. We have MXF OP Atom. So I mentioned OP1A before, which is a kind of package generally. And generally OP Atom is separated video and audio files, and that's actually the file system that Media Composer uses, the editing software from Avid. So that allows you to export the audio files in a fashion that is acceptable to editing software. And the new one here is, I actually took out the video file from the session on purpose. I can make an MOV file with audio only now, so that's an option. Previously, up until this very latest release, if you didn't have a movie file on the timeline, it wouldn't show you the MOV option. So as I say, depending on the version of Pro Tools and what you have connected, you'll have slightly different options there. Up the top of this window, we have presets, and as I click on these, you can see that I've made some presets here. For example, preset 3 is MP3, and I'm saving those to the bounce files folder. Preset number 1 is an ADM, and in this case, it's an ADM, but I've changed the directory to somewhere else. Now, this location section, as I say, has seemed to have caused a little bit of confusion, so hopefully I can clear that up. Of course, your presets will save this location information, and you know, more often than not, you're going to want your session folder in your bounce file folder, or you'll want it to prompt for location. Of course, you can save that in a preset, but now I've just opened this window and I've said prompt for location. So if I close this window and open it again, I don't want to go into Spotlight, it's going to be on prompt for location. It's going to remember the last thing I selected. So you don't need to select that every time. Just select it once, and the next time you open the window, it will be in the same setting as it was before. So that's a little bit about the bounce mix window that's available there. So that kind of takes me on to the other obvious thing that's in that window, which is about Atmos. So let me zoom on out there and jump over to my presentation again and talk about some of the Dolby Atmos enhancements. Now, the Adm File Export has been in Pro Tools for a while now, but perhaps not everyone's had an opportunity to use it yet. But we have made some improvements in just the most recent versions of Pro Tools as well, which I want to show you. So I'm going to try and do that over in Pro Tools rather than looking at a presentation. But if I forget something, Simon, please shout out if I do so. So the first one that's on the list there is the bounce mix. So as you can see, I have the ADM mix there, ADM output available there. So let me zoom into that right there. Now you'll notice that I have one bed. This is just a music track that I worked on, and 8 objects. Now you may have more beds and more objects than that, but this is just quite a simple session. So for this to work correctly, your beds must be mapped. Now that's a little bit of a new idea, because when we first had the Atmos implementation, you kind of just sent the bed off to where the beds were and only mapped the objects. In recent versions of Pro Tools, as I open up my I/O setup here, you actually map the beds as well, because you're making the ADM file from Pro Tools. It needs to know where the beds and the objects are. So when we were looking at this, we said, okay, well, what happens if there's more than one bed? Well, the great thing is Pro Tools has got a two-way connection with the renderer. So when I click on here, I can actually see in my renderer, I have another bed set up. I've got an MX bed, music bed, and a dialogue bed. Now I know that this is my music bed, so I'm going to keep that on music, and it's all in my music group. So my bed is assigned and my objects are assigned. So I can now do my ADM export from Pro Tools directly, provided of course that I'm using the native Pro Tools panner. So why is also the other good thing about using the assigning the beds is it means that the fold down path also works correctly. In previous versions, the fold down path would fold down the objects often into the monitor path, which was where the bed was usually. So that would mean that you would hear an approximation of your mix folded down when your renderer isn't available, or you're in a situation without a renderer. So you'll notice we've updated the language here. So it actually says bed object fold down path. So again, you want to make sure that your beds are mapped. So maybe some of your older sessions might not have mapped beds, so that's something you might want to update if you've got some older sessions. The other thing while we're in this window that's worth mentioning is we've now got a default to use mono or stereo buses when you connect to the renderer, because in my case, in my music session here, I'm using quite a few stereo objects, basically so I can control both sides of what was originally a stereo signal in a stereo panner in Pro Tools. So that's a nice addition there. The other one that we have got, other improvement, is in the preferences under processing. We did get some feedback from customers that the export of ADMs to network storage was a little bit slow. So we've added this caching feature so that it will actually cache to a local drive before copying that over to the network. So if you've had any ADM export speed issues on export, this should hopefully help you with that. And finally, I want to show you, before I open this on another computer, this other feature. So I currently on this computer, and I probably didn't explain it well enough in the morning session, I'm using Pro Tools Ultimate. I'm using the Dolby Atmos audio bridge from Pro Tools to the renderer, and actually the renderer is set to use my HDX card as the output, which is going through my Matrix Studio. So even though I'm using the Dolby Atmos playback engine from Pro Tools, I still get to use my HDX card and my my Matrix Studio as my monitoring device. But we now have a new option in here so that you can use that fold down path either when the renderer is disconnected for some reason, or you can turn it on to always active. The reason that we did this is we have some very clever customers who realized that if they changed the name slightly in here, they could force the fold down path to work. Now, while that was an effective way of getting the fold down path to work, we've now put in this option so that it's always active. So what's the benefit of this? Well, I have my Atmos session here, and let me just play it back a bit. It's just a music session. Maybe you can hear a little bit of that in the background. And you can see my objects are moving around and everything's connected as it should be, which is fantastic. But let's say I open the session up on another computer, and I have another computer over here, so let me switch to that very quickly, which is just a laptop and laptop speakers. I don't have anything else attached. And if we look at the playback engine, you can see I'm just using the built-in output, so that could be headphones or a laptop speaker. Now I'm going to open exactly the same session that I just opened on my computer with the renderer and everything connected. Now Pro Tools is going to be smart enough to tell me, well, you've got all these mapped items, these beds and these objects, but there's no renderer attached. Well, the cool thing is I can say, well, that's fine, thanks very much. And it's going to keep all of my beds and all of my objects working as they were before, but what it's going to do is just fold it down to the available size that I have. So it's just playing out of my laptop speakers. You might be able to hear it a little bit out of the side there. But that means that if I had a stereo room, I could still do some work. I could put the session in that room, or probably a real world scenario. You've got a dubbing suite, and maybe you've got some other edit rooms that are 5.1 or something like that. You can move these sessions back and forward really easily as long as those beds are mapped, and as long as in your I/O setup you have the output of your fold down path and your monitor path set correctly. Now if I open the same session up again on my other system, it's going to open without issue. Everything's going to go straight back to the renderer, and I can just keep working. So I think that's a really nice way of moving around. And as we mentioned earlier, Simon, in dealing with Atmos as it's developed over the years, opening someone else's Atmos session that's been on another system can be quite a lot of work to get it going to the right places. So this kind of technology of mapping and opening on a system that doesn't have a renderer is really, really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's saying earlier is, definitely going to save your bacon sometimes. This, the fact that you can open things and trust that everything's going to be in the right place, but also there are definitely going to be situations when being able to open and even roughly monitor a mix and export it from anywhere is just going to be a lifesaver.
Yeah. So we may end up running a few minutes over. I really do want to show this PEC Direct or post module workflow that we've introduced on Pro Tools. Now, like Simon talked about earlier with the frame edge sync, this is not necessarily the easiest concept to explain. So I've made a extremely simple session. And you would never have a session like this in a real scenario, but it's just to try and show as simply as I can how this might work in a real world scenario. So what I have is a source track. Now this normally would be lots of different sources, sound effects, dialogue, music, all going to its correct buses. So what I've done here is just made what would probably be a music stem, an effects stem, and a Foley stem. They've just got signal going to them, but it will illustrate the point. I've kept them in stereo just because it's a little bit easier to see the meters through the camera in stereo, but of course these can be the formats that are supported by Pro Tools up to 712. So let's have a look at how this works. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that I'm using Destructive Punch. Destructive Punch is, I've made a destructive file on the timeline, which is a WAV file on the timeline that's pre-created that I can punch in and out of without making any changes or new files. So I can export that anywhere I need to immediately. So let me switch to a slightly different view here, and we're going to be looking at the MTM of my S6 here. So this option is enabled by enabling off-disk only meters. So this means no matter if I'm recording, no matter if I'm on input, the meter on the console is going to show me what was previously recorded, so I can match back. That's what it's all about. It's about punching in and being able to get back to the previous level that you were at correctly. The other thing that you need to set in Pro Tools for this to work, if you're an S6 user, is to make sure that pre-fader metering isn't on, otherwise this is not going to work. So I'm now going to assign some channels to my console. So let's have a little look at my console here. Now for this to work, you need a post module and you need an available display module. So now I'm going to push Shift assign post on my console, and I'm going to choose my music record, my effects record, and my Foley record. Now I've just spaced them apart just to make them just a little bit easier to see. And I've made them stereo and chosen this particular layout just because it's a little easier to see. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can arrange this window. On my MTM, you can see on my module here, the one I'm pointing to just over this way, on the side of the screen as well. In purple is basically the track that I'm controlling. The direct is going to be my input into this bus, which I'm about to assign. And the PEC is the playback, this thing that we're talking about, the playback from Pro Tools, no matter what I'm doing. But rather than talking about it, let's have a look, because I think it's going to be easier to understand that way. So what I'm going to assign to the input is actually my music master bus or my music sub bus, my effects sub bus, and my Foley sub bus, which are just before my record tracks. So now I have two sets of meters that I can see beside each other. So if I'm now going to record ready my tracks, now I could link these together, so I punch them all in or go in to record all of them at the same time, but I'll just go individually just so it's a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to go back to the top of the timeline in Pro Tools, hit record, and go into playback. Now right now nothing's in record. I'll show you in Pro Tools as well. We're just playing along. We can see on these meters the green, it's a little bit hard to see its green. The green is what's coming off disk, and my red is what's going in. So let's say I wanted to make a change to the music. You can see as I push up my music sub bus, again this is a super simple example, but I can see that against what I previously had recorded on the track. So now I'm going to punch in. So now I'm in record, and we can see that Pro Tools is also recording. Let me switch back, and now even though I change my level And we can actually see that that is changing the level in Pro Tools as well. My previous meter state here on this side, if I show the camera, is where it was before. So I know where to match back to. Now, of course, I would probably use some really nice automation feature, auto join, punch preview, those kind of things. But I'm just illustrating a very manual workflow here just to help understand. So now I'm going to try and match back to that level using my trusty eye chrometer. So that looks about right on the meters here. And now let's punch out. So when I go back, you're going to see that I've gone in and out of this file. I match back to where I dropped out of, and there's no join in the file anywhere. So even though I've just punched in and out of this file, I could now export it to anywhere that I need to send it. And this is a real time saver for people working in long form. Now, of course, as I play back, and this is where this module is nice, I can punch in and out of these tracks at will as I need to, as I make changes. Let me just zoom into Pro Tools a touch more there. So I can punch in and out of these tracks as I need to, and this is what this module really gives me the ability to do if I need to make a small change. So the other thing about this is in Pro Tools Ultimate, when you use this function in Destructive Punch, it puts an automatic 10 millisecond crossfade so you don't get any clicks or pops or anything like that, because some of you watching that aren't familiar with that might think, oh, it's going to maybe make a click or a pop, but there is an automatic crossfade in there to stop that. So we are running long. We do want to leave a little bit of time for questions, but I thought I'd show you very quickly one last thing. Which is just kind of fun. Now, in the latest release of Pro Tools, we've got this on-screen virtual MIDI keyboard. And I think primarily this is for music customers, and I know there's been so many times I've been sitting on an airplane flying around the world to go to trade shows when we could do that I would have loved to have this feature. But I thought in post, actually, there's a lot of really great plugins for footsteps, for whooshes, for that kind of thing. So I just threw together a really super quick example in Falcon here, where I got some crowd applause, and I thought, well, I wanted to say thank you to Simon for his, wonderful introduction into the world of sync before. So I can give him some nice applause there. And actually, this on-screen keyboard is actually quite cool, because if I go into record, even though it's an on-screen keyboard, I can actually use that to write my audience crowd response right here. So I thought, even though it's kind of like a music feature, I thought that's just a kind of fun way that you can use it in post, and actually quite handy. I know one TV show that I helped with many years ago in New Zealand, we actually did set up crowds on a synthesizer because it was a much more natural way of putting them into the show where there wasn't actually an audience, although it was filmed to look like that. So that kind of brings us to question time, and
yeah, and
back to you, Simon.
I was just going to say, Carl on the chat is saying that he's already using that feature exactly
Awesome.
how you're describing it. So
Great.
That's a good sign.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and I was just a quick throwback to what you were saying before about the PEC Direct. That like you were saying, Pro Tools has this automation system now that means you kind of, have less to worry about in terms of matching when you're punching in. But the feedback we've had from a lot of the film mixers here in the UK is that that it's just having that visual kind of check that they're used to on a kind of traditional large console is kind of the last thing that most people were really hoping to see on the S6. So it's been very well received here, and I'm sure elsewhere.
I know for a lot of people they've been waiting for this for S6 for quite a while. So I just wanted to make sure, as the release of so many things happened at the end of last year, I just wanted to highlight it quickly so that people knew that we definitely did it.
So maybe we'll have a quick check to see what questions are coming in. We've had, I know the team's been answering quite a few questions in the Zoom. Jeff's answered a few, so it might be worth us having a quick look to see if there's any to broadcast to the world, and also on any that are coming in.
Yeah,
What have we got?
there's some answered not nice and quickly there. Um,
A couple of questions about. I had a couple of questions come in about SyncX working standalone. Like Jeff said, yeah, it's kind of yes and no. We don't. You can't. The SyncX relies on Pro Tools to control it. But I was actually asking the product team about this the other day, and it will kind of revert to a kind of internal clock output if Pro Tools isn't running. If you need to know that there's something there that's going to be running. But yes, it's mainly designed to be working alongside Pro Tools.
yeah. There was a
Let me see
question
any others.
about going back to the PEC Direct feature. So yes, this does rely on having that panel to be able to assign those on an S4 or an S6. It's a feature sort of exclusive to those surfaces, and yeah, so it does require a post module and a display module to be available to have those meters. And as I say, the setting, as I showed earlier on, is actually in the S6 itself. The enable off-disk meters is actually a setting inside of the S6 rather than in Pro Tools. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
What else? Jeff did a good job of taking care of these questions here.
Yeah.
Feel free to jump in with any that you're holding on to. Don't be shy.
Yeah, we'd love to help with whatever we can.
Someone was asking what Mac OS you're using, but yeah, so you were using Mojave, which is why
Yeah, I've got one
you're
on
seeing that QuickTime
right.
functionality.
Exactly.
Whereas I'm actually running on Catalina on the system that I showed. So on my system, if I want to bounce to a movie, I have to go to bounce to mix.
Correct. And actually so one computer that I showed was on Mojave, and my other machine's actually on Catalina, so that's exactly right. In the Mojave system, the other previous QuickTime export is there. On the newer Catalina and Big Sur, it's just the bounce mix window option. Okay. As I say, we're getting through standalone. Yeah, there's quite a few questions about the way that the SyncX works standalone. As Simon said, it's primarily based around working with Pro Tools, and in most situations that's how it's going to be used. If you are having some issue, of course, like with all things, we encourage you to make a support case if you think it's something out of the ordinary, because we can't test every single scenario that's out there, and of course we want to try and address any issues that people are having. So if you do have something that doesn't seem right, please try and get to our support team so it can get through to the right people.
Okay.
Right. It looks like we're all quiet on the question front.
Yeah, I'm just thinking back the last time when we've done this presentation, whether we had any other questions, but I think we've kind of covered most bases.
Yeah. There was a few people asking about Atmos, and actually on the Avid site, we've got some sort of intros to Atmos. And also recently we've just announced an Atmos, an official Atmos training
right.
series through Avid as well. So there's definitely a lot of resources out there about Atmos these days. I know it can be a bit confusing, beds and objects and all of those kind of words if you haven't spent much time in that world, but there's already a great bunch of stuff available from Avid and Dolby and a bunch of other manufacturers to really help get your head around what Atmos is, and now, as I say, an official training program as well.
We've got a question in from Benjamin, who was just kind of digging in a bit more on the word clock and video ref thing. Definitely not a naive question, Benjamin. Just he said that he wanted to confirm his way of thinking was video ref and word clock. That word clock is for timing and for audio, and video ref is timing for video. Is that right? Not quite, no. So, word clock can be the timing for both, and video ref could be the timing for both. So you can actually use video ref as a clock source as well. They are both essentially, a stream of pulses that are, providing some kind of a speed reference. But the difference is that.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. No, I was going to say that was a question that I saw earlier on that maybe we skipped over, or maybe it was the previous session. Like, how do I see where these video reference and my word clock is actually aligned? Interestingly enough, you can actually take these video outputs, video reference and word clock, and actually record them and see the difference between when they're locked and when they're not. And when they're not, you can see that the video frame edge, if you can get the pulse amplified enough so it can be recorded, it will shift every single time that you push stop and start. So there is actually ways that you can have a look at yourself, and I wanted to do it in time for the session today, but unfortunately with the way my gear is organized, I didn't quite have time to dig behind it. But that's something maybe we can look at it in a future session, of a really real world example of, like, this is what's going on when it is locked, and this is what's going on when it's not locked. So you can actually test it for yourself if you have a few cables available.
For sure, yeah, and I've certainly seen, there are professional sync checkers that you see in most kind of dubbing facilities, which I know I have resorted to taking a photo with my phone of the screen and the time code reader at the same time. Yeah. That is not a recommended way of checking your sync. But yeah, just to kind of follow through, complete on that previous question, about the video reference versus word clock. Yeah, so video reference, has this additional piece of information in there, which is saying when each video frame starts. So it's kind of got one more bit of information than just a pulse. In the same way that a musical clock has got, bar numbers in it, as well as it being an actual timing pulse. There's that little bit of extra information that you're getting. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Somebody asked which video codecs supported with edged sync. Basically, yeah, any video format that Pro Tools will support frame edge sync as well.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one, because obviously some codecs are built in different ways, and the person that asked that question obviously knows about interframe and iframe and so on. Now, obviously, there's different codecs. Some are not very good at shuttling because of the way that they create and store the video. They make great small files, but they're not very good for working in post-production. But the frame edge information, or where the frame should be, is still the same regardless of the way that the content of that frame is created, whether it's interframe or not. So that's it should be consistent, provided that you have the reference. Hopefully that answers that.
Should we take this last question from Andrew?
Sure.
So yeah, Andrew's asking us to confirm that the Adobe Production Suite doesn't work with the sync interface. Yeah, so this is one of the, I guess, an important distinction between using a hardware Dolby renderer and using the software renderer, is that, yeah, if you're using the software renderer, then there's a good chance you are using your Pro Tools hardware for the Dolby renderer, and therefore, yeah, you won't be using your sync peripheral. So, Dolby do list, a couple of key sort of professional differences between using a dedicated renderer and not, and that is definitely one of them, is that you have your independent Pro Tools system with that frame edge sync.
Exactly.
And there was that may change it, I guess, as in the future, depending on how we work with Atmos in the future.
Yeah, indeed. So yeah, we actually had that question earlier, whether the SyncX can be used with other applications, and not specifically just Atmos, but other editing applications. That serial port is really unique to the HDX and the HD native devices. And is the way that especially that video reference, of course you can put word clock into other interfaces, but that video reference and those other features that are there, those other kinds of clock, are exclusive really to the interface, and then that connection into Pro Tools to control it.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, we've just about gone over our time, so it might be a good chance to say thank you very much for everyone for coming along. The stream will be available to watch on YouTube later on if you didn't see the start, or if you just want to watch it all again because it's so much fun. So yeah, I'm going to let you go to bed, Daniel, in Tokyo
Yes.
time.
Indeed, I will. Well, thanks very much, and thanks for joining us, everybody. And hopefully you got some useful tidbits out of today's session.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.